Right, what's up everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, aka Mr. Delks Moses, aka I anoint myself with grease and I'm governed by caprice. And yes, this is episode 15th of our 10th book in our Book to React series. Today is April 19th, 2025, about 7 p.m. where I'm at right now. And we are almost to the finish line of finishing Racism in Europe by MacMaster. This book that came out in 2001 that covers the years 1870 to the year 2000 about all the anti-blackness and anti-Semitism that existed in Europe for a long-ass time during the 20th century, during that long-ass century, adding an extra few years on it as well. So, like I said, we're almost towards the end of this book. We're reading the final chapter today. I repeat, we are reading the final chapter today. It's only about 15 pages or so of this excellent book. If you've enjoyed this reading series, or if this is your first time tuning in, I highly suggest you go check out the other books that we've read in this series. For example, Is the Turk a White Man by Murat Erdogan. What else have we read? Cyber Racism by Jesse Daniels, the very first book we read as well. Afro-Pessimism by Frank B. Wilderson, and several other books as well that you can find on this channel. I also suggest everybody go check out the movie reviews my wife and I do on this channel. We're going to be returning to that soon. We've been taking a month-long hiatus or so, but best believe we've watched quite a few movies and we have a lot to talk about as well. So yeah, thanks to everybody who's been supporting this series. Thanks to everybody who's been tuning in. We've had great reactions to this book as well on this channel. So it's been a very, very good month. It's been a very, very good past few months as we've continued to come on live almost every day, multiple times per week to continue educating the people. You see me getting educated live in front of y'all as well and building with the knowledgeable people in my live stream. Shout out to my guy Door of L who sent me a bunch of books via email. And if you have a book that you think would be good for this reading series, I highly, highly encourage you to send it my way and we'll try to read it live on stream. In fact, the next book we read will be our second book react that was a request. The first book react that I ever did that was a full-on request was from my wife from the book Hood, which was a very short book as well, but y'all go check out that on this channel. But the next book we read will be our first request from a person that I don't know. How about that? We'll frame it that way. The first book that we got as a request will be from somebody I do not know at all. So looking forward to that. And as always, I gotta say, if you want to engage in this conversation, jump into the comments section. We'll be reading all the comments from everybody who has something to say. And one more thing I have to say is that before we start any live stream, we'll always read the comments from any previous Book to React live stream. And I checked the comments before. We don't have anything new, so we're just gonna jump straight into the text for today. So like I said, we're jumping into chapter 7. In chapter 6, it was covering how migrants from non-European places and spaces were moving to Europe to find jobs after the end of World War II and how that affected politics and society. Too long, didn't read. Basically, racism started to pop up as soon as black people and other non-white people began to move to Europe. So that's what I got to say. Let's go here to chapter 7. The New Racism and National-Populism. So, in the immediate post-war era, the official rhetoric of anti-fascist victory, both in Western and Eastern Europe, combined with the powerful challenge to scientific biological racism, created optimism among contemporaries that the evil of racism was definitively in retreat and would eventually be eliminated through education, enlightened progress, or socialism. In general, the period 1945 to 1974 was one of unprecedented economic growth, low unemployment, and solid welfare state provision, was not conducive to fascist or racist movements, which remained minuscule, fragmented, and underground. In spite of the fact that unregulated immigration was generating deep-seated problems that would erupt later into extensive racism, explicitly racist and fascist movements remained weak and politically marginalized during the third quarter of the 20th century. Typically, the vote for extreme right-wing parties like the German National Democratic Party, or NPD, the Italian Social Movement, MSI, the British National Front, NF, or the French Front National, FN, rarely reached 5% in local, regional, or national elections. However, the last quarter century, 1975 to the year 2000, witnessed a strong resurgence of racism. The media and public opinion became concerned with a rising tide of extreme violence, street-level murders and firebombings, especially by fascist youth gangs, paramilitary organizations, or skinheads aimed at immigrants or ethnic minorities. By the 1990s, police forces in Britain, France, Germany, and elsewhere were beginning to investigate more thoroughly racist incidents that had been previously neglected or underrecorded, and began to collect more systematic data. Although the upward curve in racist incidents in part reflected a more effective procedure, it also indicated a real increase in violence, while exposing a level of everyday terror that had been previously swept under the carpet by many police forces. In Britain, the Home Office reported an increase in racially motivated incidents from 4,383 in 1988 to 7,793 in 1992. In Germany, racist crimes rocketed dramatically from an average of about 250 per year between 1987 and 1990 to 2,427 in 1991, and then reached a peak of 6,721 in 1993. This was accompanied by an alarming tendency towards more lethal forms of violence, of bombings, arson, and the use of guns and knives. In Germany, the organized attacks on refugee hostels at Hoyerswerda 1991 and Rostock 1992, and the burning to death of immigrants in Mollin 1992 and Solingen 1993 created widespread concern that Nazism had not been laid to rest but was now resurfacing. And we have to remember, a lot of these racist attacks were happening not against Jewish people, because as the influx of people who were not Jewish came into Europe, many of the Jews actually were starting to move to Israel and other parts of the New World, like America and stuff like that. These are people mostly coming from the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. And so these attacks are mostly anti-black racist attacks, primarily in their focus and in their hatred. Continuing here. Whether there was a real revival of fascism or any degree of continuity with interwar Nazism is open to debate. Certainly, many of the most violent, anti-democratic, and often illegal paramilitary organizations, as well as skinhead and football hooligan gangs, consciously referred to the symbols of a Nazi or fascist past, from the display of swastikas to fascist salutes. Going here to Dorovel, he says, "Greetings, brilliant first." Thank you. Shout out to Dorovel. I just said before you showed up, Dorovel, that we're going to be reading one of your books as we finish this book. We're only about 20 pages or so from knocking out this book, so looking forward to reading one of the books that you sent to my email. And for anybody else who has a book that you think we should read, put it in the chat. Anyway, for the majority of the young males who became involved in such networks, pre-war fascism did not provide a set of ideas or coherent political traditions and ideology, but emblems of revolt, badges that helped to assert an aggressive youth subculture that could readily shock a respectable bourgeoisie order. Basically, what he's trying to say here is that many of the young white working class who were left behind by the advances of capitalism and neoliberalism basically started wearing the swastika, donning racist regalia as a way to rebel against society and show that they were left behind, right? Which I think is very particular to the white man. Like, we as black men, right, constantly are left behind in society. We don't just start spouting racist things. We don't just start becoming sexist and homophobic and xenophobic and basically gross against other people. Why is it that young white men, whenever they're left behind, whenever they're the lower classes of society, feel like they have to become racist and disrespectful against society? Something needs to be studied. Something needs to be studied there. The apparent continuity between extreme right-wing movements and Nazism was further reinforced by journalists and anti-racist organizations, like the British Anti-Nazi League, which sought to undermine the legitimacy of violent racists by depicting them in an oversimplistic way as the direct descendants of Mosley, Hitler, Goebbels, and Mussolini. While the wave of vicious beatings and murders that descended on Europe is in no way to be trivialized, I would argue that any attempt to analyze contemporary racism solely in terms of neo-Nazi organization organizations, or the cult of violence among youth gangs runs the risk of obscuring the deeper and more significant roots of racism. Basically saying here, like, instead of just focusing on the neo-Nazis, right, or the skinheads, or the youth gangs that are running around, beating up black people or immigrants from the Middle East or something like that, we have to take a deeper look at the systemic type of racism that was happening in Europe that allowed this sort of activity to fester. The high-profile nature of hooligan violence in the media, a violence that has made for sensational good copy, has often diverted attention from the analysis of the way racism has been more powerfully reproduced in normal society, including by the self-same journalists that condemn skinhead knife attacks. Who are self-same? Self-same seems like a new word. Once again, whenever we see a new word, we're going to put that in there. Self-same definition. Okay, this is a very strange word. It literally means exactly the same. I've never heard this word before. This must be British. Adjective, meaning exactly the same. If there was a word that was exactly like nail on the head, it would be it. Anyway, I can't put it in the chat now, but we'll see it later. Anyway, including by the self-same journals that condemn skinhead knife attacks. So there is no contradiction between the fact that the Daily Mail, which ran a front page campaign to expose the hooligan killers of Stephen Lawrence, had also for many years run the most vociferous and disturbing of anti-asylum seeker campaigns. Basically trying to say, imagine how in America Fox News even said that Derek Chauvin was a racist murderer. Even if they didn't use racist, they did paint this police officer who normally would have been protected by the right-wing media as, a cop who was doing his job. Basically the Daily Mail, right-wing media, at the same time they try to condemn the right-wing hooligans who were knifing up black people in the street, they were still running racist media, right? So that's what they're trying to say. All right, putting this in the chat. All right, continuing here. All right. An over-preoccupation with Nazi movements and a widespread belief that the defeat of such organizations will represent a definitive victory over the forces of darkness not only lends itself to a misreading of the nature of racism, but more seriously can drive anti-racist action in the wrong direction. Social psychological studies of violent racists show that the majority were young males, often from a deprived background of family breakdowns and educational failure, who used anti-immigrant scapegoating as a means to assert their own self-esteem and priority as Germans or English over and against parasitic outsiders. Violent attacks were invariably not planned or premeditated and were the work of individuals who were not members of neo-Nazi organizations or had little sense of a political agenda. Violence was frequently expressive, a central means by which youth subcultures, often skinheads, countered a diffuse sense of anxiety, marginalization, and failure by asserting a sense of group solidarity, bravery, and the testing of masculinity. Tests of violence that could also be directed towards women or homosexuals and changing gender roles that were also perceived to be threatening to a natural order of male dominance. Racist violence did not represent a continuity with interwar fascism, a revival of the same animal, but can be better analyzed and understood within the entirely different context of late 20th century post-industrial society. I understand where he's coming from. Basically, what Neil MacMaster is trying to say here is that when we look at the neo-Nazis and the skinheads and stuff like that, they're not an actual continuation of the Nazis and the fascists of the mid-20th century, because a lot of their ideology doesn't even make sense, right? The Germans were all about the Aryan nation, and they viewed the Aryans as basically the German people, right? The Slavs were not white, they were not Aryans. The other groups of people, like the Italians, the Turks, etc., the Middle Easterners, they were not white, they were not true Aryans. The Germans were all about that. Meanwhile, our neo-Nazis and white supremacists today basically say all white people need to hold hands. All white people, except the Jews, of course. But all white people need to hold hands and we're on the same team. That's not even a continuation of exact Nazi ideology. So basically what Neil MacMaster is trying to say here is that what we actually should think about is the systemic racism that was permeating in our societies rather than the random acts of violence of young white men who are out of work, unemployed, and really fucking stupid. A thing that I've always thought about is like how America invaded Iraq and how after we toppled Saddam's regime, basically there were a bunch of paramilitary organizations running around. You basically had like the Shia Muslim militias versus the Sunni Muslim militias and different off branches of Al-Qaeda running around Iraq and the Middle East. That's sort of how I look at like the neo-Nazis, right? You knock down the big dog, but now you have the little homies running around and they've twisted the ideology. They come up with their own splinter groups and sects and things like that. So I look at the neo-Nazis as like somewhat different from Neil MacMaster, but as remnants of an old regime that have now become like paramilitary terrorist groups. That's how I look at them, right? Anyway, going here to Book of L. He says, book suggestion, All White People Are Racist by a White Man, Caleb Murphy. Some of these books are crazy. Some of these book titles are hilarious. Some of these book titles just could be live streams in and of themselves. But shout out to Dorvel for that. That's a hilarious title. All White People Are Racist by a white man named Caleb Murphy. Continuing here. Although the surge of youth violence, the horrific killing and maiming of blacks and Jews must not be understated, it is important that such manifestations are not misread as the key indicator of society as a whole. The great majority of Europeans abhor such acts, nor that the danger that they presented to the political system, a kind of Weimar syndrome, be exaggerated. Far more significant in late 20th century racism than revived swastikas has been the growth of three interrelated phenomenon: the skillful elaboration and diffusion of a new racism that offered a powerful ideological revision of traditional biological racism, the concurrent emergence and electoral challenge of xenophobic national-populist parties that made use of the new current of thinking on cultural racism and national identity, and lastly, the tendency of new right conservative parties, as well as socialists and all mainstream parties, to play to the same gallery, particularly through the construction of a fortress Europe and the scapegoating of refugees. These three levels are next analyzed in more detail. Very interesting. All right, so going here to new racism. The so-called new racism derived from a consciously elaborated and highly effective strategy to recast the ideological expression of racism so that it assumed a new cultural form that would enter into common usage and influence the way people viewed the world. A racism in disguise. Going to Dorvel, he says, yeah, the title, All White People Are Racist, and the last name of the authors are eye-opening. Okay. Yeah, the title of the book and the last name of the authors are eye-opening. Okay, we'll check it out, man. We're going to check out that book. Maybe send it my way. You have my email. Shoot it to me. I'll add that to the library. But yeah, go into this cultural new racism. This is the racism that we live with today. This is the one that people think is common and it's okay to say. This is when people say some cultures are civilized and other cultures are not. Some people are civilized and other people are not. That when people say that we shouldn't allow immigrants because they have a different culture than us and their culture cannot assimilate, forgetting the fact that they're human and being human is about assimilation. It's about adapting. We're the species that exists on every corner of this planet except Antarctica, right? Like humans are able to adapt and change to other human social constructs because at the very least we can adapt to our biological surroundings. So it's this new cultural form of racism is still very commonly used. Continuing here. The problem with building a politics based on race, meaning specifically the biological racism derived from the pre-1945 era, was that scientific racism was widely discredited, both as a pseudoscience as well as its association with Nazism. As Alain de Benoit, the guru of the French New Right, remarked, "It is evident that the word race scares people because of its affective charge, so one doesn't use it anymore." The fascist intellectual Maurice Bardache claimed in 1979 that the substitution of the idea of culture for the idea of heredity is the pivot at the center of the whole renewal of the right proposed by the GRECE. It might be argued that there was nothing really new about this. As I have shown in the introduction, the scientific racism that developed during the Enlightenment and throughout the 19th century and early 20th centuries was fundamentally an expression of cultural attitudes that were recoded through the methodologies and discourse of objective and empirical research. The measurement of skulls, microscopic investigation of blood and tissues, linguistic analysis. In this sense, all racism is cultural. The new racism may not be so new, but it did mark an important strategic shift in the way in which not only fascists and overt racists, but many other groups, from conservatives to liberals, have sought to legitimate exclusionary forms of difference or identity. In France, the strategy of what has been called differentialist racism was formulated primarily through an attack on and subversion of or inversion of multiculturalism. During the late 1970s, anti-racist movements in France, faced with the assimilationist traditions of republicanism, laid claim to the droit à la différence, the right of difference, the right of immigrant ethnic minorities to retain their own language, religion, and cultural identity. All right. Go in here. Dorvel says, that is a cheap one on Amazon. Don't have the PDF for that one. Okay. For anyone who wants to know where I get my books, by the way, for anybody that wants to know, I go to libgen.is. Libgen.is. This is where I get all my books generally that I find interesting that I add to my library on my computer. So yeah, if you ever need a hookup on books, that's the place. Dorvel says all this stuff was incubated and codified in America first. Dorvel, I disagree with you. I disagree with you that all of this racism stuff started in America. America might have reified it. America might have perfected it. America might have took it to the next level. But I believe that the white supremacy and the acts of explicit anti-black racism and genocide were practiced in Europe first. For centuries, the Europeans practiced on their own people what they eventually did to us. Before they got the black African and sent them across the sea and whipped them and worked them to death, they were doing that to the Romanis. Before they did pogroms where they chased us all through the woods and grabbed us, threw us on a tree, lynched us, and cut off our dicks, they were doing that to the Jews. Before they were, raping our women to the extent that we have whole new populations of people that are multi-mixed with European DNA, they were doing that to their own women. Before we had the Dominican Republic, Brazil, that is full of big booty, fine, badass colored broads, they were doing that to their own women all throughout the continent. You get what I'm saying? The white man's history has been nothing but violence. The white man's history has been nothing but degradation to themselves. And then they exported it to the world. Facts. That's how I understand it. So, I disagree with the idea that, racism and anti-blackness start in America. They were doing that for centuries in Europe. All right. Anyway, continuing here, basically during the 70s, the French were talking about the idea that the immigrants to France can maintain their language, their culture, religion, etc. And the new right subtly transformed this into the right to differ of majority European national cultures, which were under threat from the intrusion of alien, non-European peoples and their traditions. The French, along with any other European nation, had as much right to prevent the decline and erosion of their ethnicity as did primitive tribal peoples of the Amazon jungles faced with extinction. The unionism would lead to a leveling, a uniform and standardized culture that would eradicate the rich diversity of global languages, customs, and traditions. The new right revived a highly conservative or Volkish discourse that endowed a people, i.e. race, with a mythic unity that was rooted in untold ages, thousands of years of shared language, customs, and kinship. Just as pre-war racism had shown an abhorrence of intermarriage between races, a mixing of blood that would lead to an inevitable biological degeneration, so the new right deployed the mixing of cultures, since this would lead to irreparable damage to the cultural integrity and identity of both autochthonous and minority groups. All right, we got to look up that word. We see a new word. All right, autochthonous. Well, this is a new one. I can't even say that. Autochthonous. Autochthonous. Autochory. All right, we'll just look up autochory. The process of seeds and fruits dispersal by the means of some kind of explosion or physical expulsion. Okay, so like that's what autochthony means. All right, hold on. I'm putting this in the chat. Whenever we see these new words, man, these new words be killing me. All right, hold up. That's that. Autochthony. Hold on, wait. Autochory. I'm sorry, I got y'all tripping. Okay. All right, autochory means autochory. We're all in this thing trying to figure out what the fuck is this word. All right, hold on, wait. We gotta find this word. Y'all see this thing, man? Hold on. What is this word? A-U-T. Oh, my autocorrect. A-U-T-O-C-H-O. No, C-H. What the hell? Oh my God. Okay. All right. How do you say this? Hold on, wait. We're gonna play this. Hold up. Talkery. Hold on, wait. Hold on, wait. This is insane. Hold on, wait.
Autochthonous.
Okay, we'll never forget this word. Autochthonous. Jesus. I sound like a 17th century like British anthropologist. Autochthonous. All right, and it's an adjective meaning inhabited by a place of indigenous rather than descended. Okay. All right. Of an inhabitant of a place indigenous rather than descended from migrants or colonists. Newly colonized islands hitherto inhabited by autochthonous people. Interesting. Okay. All right. Anyway, going back to Dorval, we in this country like to say our struggle is the greatest in America. I agree. Dorval says means aboriginal. Okay, I get it. Now. Thank you, Dorval, for the definition. I didn't see you there first. I didn't see it there. Sorry for anybody. Shout out to Kamal for jumping into the live stream chat. Oh, that was so crazy. How could I not know this word? I've never seen that word. That's a wild word. That's one of the longest words in English. Aboriginal, says Dorval. Okay, got it. Anyway, basically, what he's talking about here is that the left in France was saying people that move to France have the right to retain their language, their culture, their religion. They don't have to violently assimilate into French culture. So then the right said, well then, if that's the case, they have the right to differentiate. We as French people, we as white Europeans have the right to differentiate from these people. And their culture will never be like our culture, and we have the right to preserve it, right? So, let's continue here. So, the Front National program stated, a people that loses its identity, that no longer knows who it is or where it comes from or what values it embodies, is a people condemned to death. No people can assimilate and integrate a large number of foreigners belonging to civilizations totally different from its own. Logically, it followed from this that peoples, races with radically different cultures should not intermingle, but be spatially segregated and follow a separate development, as in the apartheid system of South Africa. The New Right and the FN use such arguments to justify policies of exclusion and repatriation. Arab Muslims, Afro-Caribbeans, Asians, and others should be sent home, both to protect French culture from being swamped, a basic right to difference, as well as to enable immigrants whose cultural identity was also damaged through contact with European society to recover their own traditions. A number of advantages followed from the new racist discourse. Politicians and ideologues of the far right could strenuously deny that they were racist, since they did not argue that one group was superior to any other. Enoch Powell, challenged in a 1969 television interview as to whether he was a racialist, replied, "If by being a racialist, you mean a man who despises a human being because he belongs to another race, or a man who believes that one race is inherently superior to another in civilization or capability of civilization, then the answer is emphatically no. Le Pen has used the same tactic. When challenged on his virulent hostility to minorities of North African descent in France, he replies that he has nothing but admiration for Arab civilization, but Muslims can best enjoy their own culture in an unspoilt form at home, just as white Christian Europeans should be allowed to protect their cultural heritage. Go into the comments. Jacqueline Batalora says, white was one created to divide in her book. Do you have that one? I don't have that book. But send that book to me, by the way. Love the book suggestions for Dora-L. Me and Dora-L just need to come together and open a library. Me and Dora-L just need to open up a library, and we're going to call it Gays. Gays Library. I just want to troll them. I just want to troll Dora-L. We're going to call it the Gay Bookshop. And yeah, we're gonna just have a bunch of like pro-black, anti-racist books on the shelves, and also coffee, and we're gonna have open mic night with like drag queens just to piss off Dora-L. All right, continuing here. So I am not xenophobic, nor does the fact that I like the French in France and best mean that I hate foreigners or hate other countries. I repeat, I am not xenophobic, nor does the fact that I like the French and France best mean that I hate foreigners or hate other countries. Dora-L says, you funny, man. I'm trying to make y'all laugh here as we educate. Anyway, however, in this discourse, culture is synonymous with race, identical in meaning and in political import to the older tradition of biological racism. This is revealed by the way in which cultural boundaries are made absolute or are founded on the natural order. National, racial identities are so rooted in the language and culture of the organic community that no outsider can ever become assimilated into the people. All right, Dora-L says donuts. Yeah, we're going to sell donuts, but in the donuts, we're also going to have, little like candy dicks that can go into the donut hole. And all the donuts are going to be pink in frosting. All the donuts will be pink in frosting, but we have little dick plugs you can put into the donuts, and we're going to sell that to people at Gays, pro-black, anti-racist bookshop and coffee. All right. Anyway, continuing here. So, all right. Again, as Powell, a precursor of the New Right, stated in 1968, the West Indian or Indian does not, by being born in England, become an Englishman. In law, he becomes a United Kingdom citizen by birth. In fact, he is still a West Indian or Asian. The New Right underpinned its arguments by references to sociobiology. If nations/peoples best functioned as homogeneous units, this was because genetic evolution had ensured that kin groups operated most effectively as an organic whole. Sally Schreier was typical of those who deployed a naturalizing discourse suffused with socio-biological meanings. Human beings live in nations with the same certainty as certain species of fish live in shoals and certain species of dogs live in packs. Nationalism, she claimed, is a ubiquitous attitude stamped on the human species by nature. Or again, national identity is founded on natural emotions and natural allegiances. In this circular reasoning, certain ways of doing are right because they are natural, and if they are natural, they must be true. Underlying the discourse of the New Right is a message of cultural racism, difference, and exclusion that rejects the presence of immigrants within European society. Even if minorities try to assimilate into the host society, they can never succeed in becoming one of us, separated as they are by cultural or natural boundaries as absolute as those of interwar scientific racism, which argued that the converted Jew always remained a Jew. In this discourse, the distinction between the terms nation, race, and culture was deliberately blurred, enabling Le Pen, for example, to make a powerful emotional appeal to a populist French nationalism founded on the symbolism of a mythical and idealized past. The homeland is the land of our fathers, a country fashioned by its countryside, its cities, its language, history, and enriched by efforts fertilized by their sweat and blood. All living things are assigned by nature to those areas conforming to their dispositions or affinities. It is the same thing for men and peoples. Go into the comments. Dora-L says, you killing me, LOL. Man, we gonna kill it at this, man, I swear. We gonna kill it every single night. We gonna have big booty, afro wearing, fine ass, Chocolate Sisters coming through, buying all our anti-racist books, listening to our lectures, and then also at the same time, we're going to have fine-ass, big booty, trannies coming through, popping bussy on the open mic night as we open the floodgates to all black people. Because we love all black people, right? We got no hate for no black folks, right? We're an anti-racist bookshop. We're here trying to educate the people, and the doors are open for anybody that want to pop that bussy. Or any fine ass bras that want to pop that pee. We're gonna do it all. We're gonna have it all at Gays, pro-black, anti-racist, pro-trans bookshop, rainbow flags and everything. I'm sorry. I can't. I'm going off the ledge. Anyway. The new racist discourse also provided a powerful weapon in the fight against anti-racism by confusing critics who continued to see racism within traditional biological terms as an unaltered Nazism, and by neatly sidestepping any challenge formulated in this way. It also inverted the logic of racism, in which minorities were the target, by presenting the majority white society as the victim of multicultural bigots or of a race relations industry bent on disrupting indigenous society through the imposition of foreign religions, customs, and language. In 1984 and 1985, Ray Honeyford, the right-wing head of a Bradford school in which 90% of the pupils were Asian, was forced to resign over his public attack on multiculturalism. Honeyford was immediately supported by a senior conservative politician, or a number of politicians, and the tabloid press as a victim of intolerant left-wing groups determined to destroy English national identity. Tensions within society, it was argued, did not therefore arise from white racism, but rather from an anti-British racism intent on destroying the previous harmonious indigenous community. I mean, this is sort of like the criticism that people have of Black Lives Matter or the left in general, is that basically white folks want to still be able to say racist stuff and never face any consequences for it. Right? And so when people actually say, hey, what you're saying or doing is racist, people then say, you are now causing racism because you are calling out the action that I did supposedly without any thought in my mind of people's race. All I said was that Asian students shouldn't be in my school. But I didn't say that to be racist, is what the white supremacists or latent or implicit white supremacists would say. So then they would say, oh, the left is making racism happen. Or the anti-racist activists or the people who are affected by racism are causing it to happen because they're calling it out. It's silly. All right. Doravel says, wake up the masses. We're going to wake up the masses, and we also going to have them shaking they asses at gays, pro-black, LGBTQIA plus and indigenous coffee and bookshop. I swear, our coffee and bookshop is going to be so lit. We're going to have everybody in there. We're going to have all the pro-black cuties, and we're going to have all the pro-LGBTQ bussies popping it. It's going to be so lit. Because we're all inclusive. We are all in the fight against white supremacy, right? We're all in the fight against white supremacy. So we're going to hold hands with that beautiful man with the manicured nails and a wig on. Anyway. Very interesting stuff here. Let's continue. So, similarly, the FN presented itself as the victim of anti-French racism, or defined racism as a doctrine denying the right of people to be themselves. The French are today the principal victims of it in their own country. The attack on anti-racism was one strand in which much wider authoritarian nationalism, or Thatcherism and its continental equivalents, which presented a picture of a healthy society undermined by moral decay, the disintegration of the family, a breakdown of law and order, and the promotion of feminism and homosexual rights. Anti-racism was frequently attacked in tabloid cartoons by associating it with loony left fanatics, a subversive group of lesbians, pot-smoking hippies, Marxist, feminists, radical teachers, and other demons of the populist right imagination, intent on the destruction of religion, morals, the family, and the traditional order. Ideal blunt rotation. I'm in here with lesbians, pot-smoking hippies, Marxist, feminists, ideal blunt rotation. All right. Dorvell says the macho snap queen. Now, I haven't read your book yet. I haven't read the text about the snap queen yet. But all I know is we're going to have a bunch of queens up in the gays, pro-black, anti-racist bookshop. And a bunch of queens, indeed. They're going to be snapping as we listen to the spoken word poetry of Alaska Thunderfox, our resident DJ. Alaska Thunder. Maybe RuPaul can come through too. Man, we gonna have it so lit. Our man, I can't wait to open the shop and make a ton of money selling books and bussy. We selling bussy in the back, guys. You want to have a good time? Come to the back of. I'm sorry. Anyway. The strategy of the New Right, drawing upon the theory of the Italian Marxist philosopher Antonio Gramsci, was based on the perception that state power depended not solely on material force and economic relations, but also on cultural hegemony, the ability to control the way people perceive the world through the formation of ideas, language, and discourse, the basic building blocks of meaning. The attempt to invert and subvert the multiculturalist meaning of the right of difference, providing a defense of segregation and apartheid, or the displacement of race by culture, thus denying any racist intent, was typical of this hegemonic strategy. How successful was the New Right in achieving its goals? Firstly, the hegemonic project was elaborated with considerable sophistication by intellectuals who operated within far-right think tanks or circles. In Britain, the Monday Club, Tory Action, the Salisbury Group, founded in 1976, and its journal, the Salisbury Review. In France, the Group for Research and Study of European Civilization, GRECE, founded in 1968, and the Club de l'Horloge in Germany, by those grouped around the review, New Anthropologie, and similar organizations in Italy, Belgium, Russia, the USA, and South Africa. If the elaboration of a new racist discourse had remained confined to small elitist circles, it would have remained of quite limited significance. But the New Right was highly successful in finding a bridge over and into mainstream politics and the formation of public opinion. The think tanks of the New Right belong to an international network of shared publications, conferences, and other fora in which the central concepts were refined and disseminated. GRECE, for example, had a membership that extended to Italy, Germany, Britain, Belgium, Sweden, Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, and Czechoslovakia. All right. Bussy, not pussy, bussy. Exactly. We got pussy and bussy. We got everything you want and need. You know what? It's no longer a coffee shop. It's just a full-on speakeasy. We're gonna open an anti-racist, pro-black coffee shop / speakeasy, LGBTQIA, indigenous plus, land back, all the things, all together. We're just gonna open a speakeasy. Everybody's gonna be dressed in 1920s tuxedos, but they have to be rainbow printed. And on top of that, everybody has to recite at least one line of a Malcolm X speech to enter the speakeasy. You got to tap the door 7 times, like the God number. You got to drop the God number. You have to answer who is the original man to get through the first door. Then through the second door, you have to recite at least one line of a Malcolm X speech. Plymouth, I didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on me. And then you get in through the door. And then you're greeted by the sounds, the sights, and the smells of cocoa butter and KY jelly and Vaseline and all sorts of smells, sights, and sounds that accompany beautiful black women and badass trannies popping that bussy on the dance floor. Yo, our speakeasy is going to be so lit. Anyway, continuing here. One way in which the New Right consciously planned its hegemonic strategy was by establishing a foothold in the mass media, where its ideas and the deployment of a new vocabulary could be recast in a more populist and common sense form. Members of the French GRECE had direct links to press magnates Raymond Bourgin and Robert Hersant, who facilitated their access to key positions or as regular columnists or journalists. Louis Pauwels, editor of Figaro magazine, disseminated right-wing ideas through this weekly. Ideologues of the new racism had regular columns in the Sunday Telegraph, Peregrine Wortherson, and Daily Telegraph. T. Utley, member of the editorial board of the Salisbury Review. The Times, Sir Alfred Sherman, speechwriter for Mrs. Thatcher. Philosopher Roger Scruton, editor of the Salisbury Review. The Mail, Andrew Alexander. The Sun, Professor John Vincent. The Express, George Gale. And the Star, Robert McNeill. Right-wing intellectuals and elitists who in the past had avoided low-brow tabloids like The Sun now reveled in skillfully adapting the cultural racism of the new right circles into a populist format. All right. Kamal says lightning bolts, Black Rock, and then the OK sign. Okay. Door of L says Barnes and Hobos. That's a fire name. Okay, so we're going to call it Barnes and Hobos, but then we're also going to have like a little subtext under it. Like we'll still call it Gays, Pro-Black, Anti-Racist Speakeasy. Okay, but still, we're elaborating on the idea. Guys, we're brainstorming here. How are we going to bring education to the masses but still get fat, big booty trans asses on the dance floor? How are we going to do it? All right, Thatcherism was extremely successful in translating an authoritarian and xenophobic nationalism into the form of a common sense racism. Central to all the columnists lay the message that it was a natural instinct to bond with one's own kind, with kith and kin, and that this also naturally should determine the priority of British or English culture and identity over that of aliens. Such exclusionary messages were readily couched in the platitudes and obvious truths of everyday discourse. The blood is thicker than water, and charity begins at home. Moreover, those like Hungerford, who utilized such common sense categories, were presented as those who dared to speak their mind, to utter what most of the ordinary people thought, in defiance of the intolerance of the politically correct, the gangs of socialists, lesbians, pacifists, and anti-racists who would like to destroy the freedom of speech. In a similar way, Le Pen projected an image of himself as the rough diamond, the man of the people, who stood up for the rights of the indigenous French, and who bravely said what everybody was secretly thinking. Again, such a hierarchy of racial preference was grounded in the common sense truth of a natural order. I love more my daughters than my cousins more than my neighbors more than those I don't know, those that I don't know more than my enemies. The success of the new right hegemonic strategy can be shown by the extent to which its racist vocabulary and arguments became generalized, appropriated by a wider public, and made its own. For example, supporters of the pro-fox hunting countryside alliance, leaning against the doors of their Range Rovers, have presented themselves as a disempowered and endangered minority. Ultimately, it is this everyday racism, almost universally diffused within society, sustained by millions of daily speech acts, that constitute the bedrock of prejudice and violence. Very interesting stuff right here. So basically what he's trying to point out, as neoliberal societies said that they're premised on the idea that everybody is equal, everybody should have a chance, there should be no explicit discrimination, and as biological and scientific racism start to fall out of vogue, basically as immigrants continue to flood into Europe, people are saying things like, well, we have the right to protect our own culture, right? They get to keep some elements of their culture. We deserve to protect our own borders, our own people, right? And if you have that sort of logic, you also have to think, okay, you should also have the right to not take the resources from the third world. You should also have the gumption not to do that. You should also be saying we can be self-sufficient as Europe. We demand that the Africans, the Asians, the Latin Americans, all the people that migrate to Europe or the Western nations, they won't come as long as we won't continue to take their resources. They won't come. They should not come as long as we can continue to be self-sufficient. We don't need the gold, the copper, the diamonds that come from Africa, from Latin America, from Asia, etc. So they won't come, right? Anyway, that's what it should be, but that's what it's not. Continuing here. The rise of national populism. The strategies of the new racist ideologues made a significant contribution to the growth of a new kind of national-populist party, of which the French FN acted as the leader and the exemplar for the radical right in Europe. Typical of this realignment of the far right are the German Republikaner Party, the Schweizerisch Volkspartei, or SVP, or Swiss People's Party, the Austrian Freedom Party, FPO, or of George Haider, the Flemish Bloc, VB, the Danish People's Party, DPP, the Northern League, NL, of Umberto Bossi, the Norwegian Progress Party, and the Italian National Alliance, the former Italian Social Movement, or MSI. The new populists tend to share a number of features. Although leaders like Le Pen and Haider have in the past made anti-Semitic, pro-Nazi, or Holocaust denial statements, on the whole they have tended to play this down, to dissociate themselves from the old neo-Nazi tradition and anti-parliamentary violence, and opted instead for political legitimacy and a quest for power within the democratic electoral system. In an ambiguous way, while playing within the rules of paramilitary politics, these parties have generally been against the system, tapping into popular discontent with long-ruling parties of both right and left, which are portrayed as corrupt and bloated with rich pickings, out of touch with the ordinary man, and too elitist to sense the anxieties and problems of the little people when faced with rising crime, parasitic immigrants, high taxes, the decline in moral standards, and loss of national pride. Nelson Moreno, Simon, I love the educational videos, but what happened to your film reviews? AFD is a Nazi party. They all crooks. They all crooks. Shout out to Nelson Moreno. Bom dia, bonsoir, I don't know. Saudade, I don't know. A lot of Portuguese. Watched a very interesting Portuguese documentary. Nelson Moreno, more film reviews coming soon, man. It's just Acti's been hella busy. Acti's finishing her master's. My wife is now officially a psychologist. You know what's crazy? I posted on my channel, possibly even like 2 years ago to date. 2 or 3 years ago to this date. I can't remember. I posted on my video the day that Acti got accepted into her psychology program here in Hungary. And now 2 years later, she's about to graduate, and my wife is officially about to become a psychologist. But she's overcoming that last hurdle of becoming one by finishing her master's. So she was writing her thesis over these past few weeks, and she's been hella busy also teaching English to like kids in Turkey, and also teaching Turkish to adults in America, right? So she's hella busy, so we haven't had a chance to watch movie reviews, do the movie reviews, but we've been watching movies, and that will be done, right? Nelson Moreno, shout out to Nelson Moreno, and let us know, Nelson Moreno, what is the Nazi party? What is the Nazi party in Portugal? Continuing here. All right. Nelson Moreno says, Dr. Acti, let's go. Yes, Dr. Acti is here. She's now in session. But if you want to book a session, you got to come through me. I don't trust none of you niggas. I don't trust none of you niggas. If you want to sit down with my beautiful, sexy wife for an hour and a half, you gotta holler at the boss. We can get you a session. I know a lot of you need psychological help. A lot of y'all are mentally disturbed, but you gotta holler at your partner. You gotta holler at your partner first. And you also gotta send it to my PayPal. Continuing. All right. Doravelle says, homophobia sensitivity. Shout out Doravelle. I need the homophobia sensitivity training. I need it, brother. I'm a full-on ally. I'm a full-on ally to the LGBTQIA plus XYZ community. I'm a full-on ally. I don't get how I need the sensitivity training. I'm sensitive to their issues. Nelson Moreno says the Chega party. Shout out to Chega. Chega. What does Chega mean? And what are the fascists? Are the fascists in Portugal? Are they like trying to resurrect like the fascist regime of that leader that you had many years ago? Or are they just like street thug like Nazis? You know what I mean? Are they like MAGA? Is it like Donald Trump's MAGA? Or is it like, how FN party, Front National? Anyway, shout out Doravelle. Shout out Nelson Moreno. Let's continue here. All right, so So for these parties, generally neoliberal in their economic policies, the state is regarded as overextended and liberty is defined in highly individualistic terms. Most national populist parties are dependent upon a charismatic leadership. Men like Le Pen, Haider, Anders Lang, Franz Schonhuber, Uberto Bossi, Christoph Blocher, who claim to speak up for the ordinary people whose dreams and sorrows they comprehend. But invariably, at the core of national populism is a crudely enunciated xenophobia, a scapegoating of ethnic minorities and refugees as the principal sources of those ills associated with the disintegration of the post-war settlement, full employment and the welfare state, and with perceptions of rising crime and insecurity. All right. Dorvell says, you got booty tattoos? No, I don't have booty tattoos. No. I'm only tatted on my upper part of my chest. I'm only tatted on the upper part of my chest because that's the section your mama like to rub on. This is the section that she likes to grease up, oil up and down. She say, oh, I love your big arms, Mr. Hill. And I say, shut up. I say, shut up and bend it over. Pop it from the back. That's what I tell her. You feel me? So, I don't have booty tattoos, but I definitely tattooed a few mama's booties with ropes and ropes of big dick black cum. All right? Nelson Moreno says, Chega means enough. Enough. If there's a right-wing party called Enough... if there's a right-wing party called Enough, we need a left-wing party called Fuck or Fuck This. Because the right wing say Enough. We need a left-wing party that just says, fuck it. You know what I mean? Anyway, they're basically populist. They're basically a populist anti-immigration party. Interesting. So are they talking about like kicking out the illegals? Or are they saying like stop them from coming in? Are they trying to stop like the black folks in Portugal from getting citizenship? Let us know. Tell us about Chega. Chega sounds like a very good type of cheese. Continuing here. So, the respectable leaders and militants of the new parties lay claim to an insidious legitimacy, the acceptable face of racism. Men who, in the words of Paul Taggart, are more likely to be wearing bespoke suits than military fatigues. Unlike their old neo-Nazi forebears, the national-populists have shown an ability to break the mold of the old party stranglehold and to make significant electoral gains. They also succeeded in breaking out from the ghetto of skinhead violence and parading to gain electoral support from all social classes, including middle class and professional groups. Crucial to the process of legitimation was the skillful use of the new racist discourse to jettison overt forms of biological racism and to claim merely a reasonable right to protect national identity and culture. All right, continuing here. The FN showed the way with its gain of 11% of the national votes in the 1984 European election, rising to 14.9% in the 1997 general election. Although the FN was later to disintegrate under the impact of an internal split and the breakaway of Bruno Margret in January 1999, other parties have continued to show dynamic growth. Going to Dorvell in the comments, he says Cisco and lard. Exactly. Those are the types of greases. Those are the types of greases me and some of y'all mamas who get disrespectful to me, we like to use. Your mama, she comes in with the Cisco and the lard. I spank her on a big fat booty. I tell her, turn around, bitch. I tell her, turn around, and then I spread it all over her cheeks, and then we get to clapping it. The clapping it is happening. Shit gets crazy up in there. Shit gets to popping like bacon grease on the stove. You feel me? It gets really nasty. All right, Nelson Moreno says, I don't know what they want. They just bitch, moan, and be racist. Yeah. Sounds like a lot of little dick energy. Enough. Shut the fuck up. Instead I tell them, enough bitching. Enough crying. Chega. Stop all that bitching. Stop all that crying. Anyway, continuing here. The Flemish bloc scored 9.9% in the general election of 1999, the Italian National Alliance of 15.7% in 1996, the Norwegian Progress Party 15.3% in 1997, the Northern League 10.1% in 1996, and most threatening of all, the Austrian Freedom Party won 27.7% in October 1999, enabling it to enter government in alliance with the People's Party. In the same month, the Swiss People's Party, led by millionaire Christoph Blocher, came from nowhere to take the largest share of the vote, 25%, and to challenge the two-party status quo held since the 19th century by the Christian Democrats and the Liberals. Blocher played to two basic fears: dislike of immigrants and refugees, and anxiety about the EU, particularly the projected enlargement to the east. Austria and Switzerland are two of the wealthiest nations in Europe, an indication of the fact that xenophobia and racism has not necessarily been an expression of economic hardship, but just as much much linked to high levels of insecurity about national identity and a sense of impending doom. Very interesting. All right. Nelson Moreno says, Simon smashed my mom and he took all the food in my fridge. Yes, indeed. I tried all those definite Portuguese delights. I was up in Nelson Moreno's crib and he was very nice. He was very respectful. He opened the door to me and said, hello, Mr. Hill. And then he said, sorry, Comrade Hill. And then I said, it's okay, man. And I said, where's your mama? And he said, she's in the back. I came in the back. She was dressed in beautiful red lingerie and it was very sensual, and the place smelt a bit funny. It smelt a bit wild, but we got to business and we handled it well. I left some food for Nelson Moreno, but then I said, nah, I need it. You get what I'm saying? So I basically, took some pastel de nata. I took a little bit of the pastel de nata, the polvo alligator, octopus with olive oil. Yeah, I took some of that. Took some porco preto. Oh, that was very delicious. Arroz de pato. Ooh, that was so good. Sardinas asadas I didn't like so much because I don't like sardines. The Francesina took some of that too. That was very good. Arroz de marisco. Oh, that was so good. Acordo. I don't really like that. Didn't like the consistency of the achordo. But I like the quejo. The quejo. Oh, that was so good. I love cheese. So I was farting a lot that night. Farting a lot after that. Anyway, continuing here. Racism, the ambiguities of mainstream parties. Although national populism played an important role in the overt expression of racist attitudes and policies, it could be argued that the most crucial factor in the reproduction of racism has been the role of mainstream political parties and governments. Wherever racist movements have begun to make significant electoral inroads, traditional parties, instead of placing a cordon sanitaire around the extremists and trying to deny them legitimacy within the democratic political system, have invariably themselves tried to occupy the same terrain by moving to the right and taking a hard anti-immigrant position. In France, both the conservatives of the RPR and the UDF, as well as the socialists, drifted in the direction after Le Pen's FN gained 11% of the national vote in the European elections of 1984, and in some cases began to imitate the language of the FN. Giscard d'Estaing stressed the dangers of an immigrant invasion and proposed that France return to the traditional conception of the acquisition of nationality, that based on the rights of blood. Charles Pasqua, Minister of the Interior in 1986 and 88 and 93, remarked, yes, there are a few extremists in the National Front, but basically the National Front has the same preoccupations, the same values as the majority. It merely expresses them in a more brutal and noisy way. Conservative leaders at local or regional level on numerous occasions showed a willingness to enter into electoral alliance with the FN where it was perceived that they had the balance of power, a practice that added to the legitimacy of Le Pen's movement. In France, as elsewhere, the national-populists often had a major impact on the political system, even when their total vote was too low to gain entrance to government. The strategies of the new racist or new right ideologues impacted not only on the populists, but also on classic conservative or mainstream parties. In Britain, Mrs. Thatcher dramatically ended the electoral rise of the National Front by acknowledging the legitimacy of the problems raised by it and being prepared to deal with it, a goal that was achieved by the adoption of a new right discourse. While denying that she was a racist, Mrs. Thatcher went on to spell out the dangers of 4 million new Commonwealth immigrants. Now that is an awful lot, and I think it means that people are really rather afraid that this country might be swamped by people with a different culture. Members of the Salisbury Group like Ray Honeyford, Jonathan Aitken, Rhodes Boyson, Julian Amory, and Enoch Powell played a key role in the formation of Tory ideology or had a direct entree to Downing Street. All right, go into the comments. Nelson Moreno says it smelled funky because Biden was there before. Oh, you know that thing smelled like Bengay. All right, damn, you know all the cuisine. I'm just trying to educate myself, man, on some delicious food, man. I was looking for some prego. I went into the kitchen in Nelson Moreno's house. I said, "Where's the prego? Donde es prego?" And there was no prego around. So I got very mad. But then she brought out some leitao asado. Oh, it was so delicious. The leitao asado was so good. Bon. Yes, and though, yeah. So yeah, next time I come around, make sure you have some of the foods out for me. The type of stuff I'm looking for. I need that Pareto. All right, continuing here. At the heart of European liberal democracy at the beginning of the 21st century lies a contradictory and Janus-faced attitude towards racism. David Goldberg has argued that the irony of liberal modernity committed to idealized principles of equality is that it has failed to take racism seriously, to recognize how far it is woven into the history and the very fabric and institutions of Western societies. Share a dominant discourse that asserts the fundamental values of freedom, equality, and the protection of individual or minority rights, regardless of race, religion, or ethnic affiliation. Post-war governments have set out to demonstrate their anti-racist credentials through passing legislation that allows racial discrimination and through acceptance, to a lesser or greater extent, of multicultural policies. All member states have signed the EU declaration which commits them to combat racism. Leading politicians, prime ministers, and top officials constantly defer to a universal moral order in which racism, fascism, and the denial of basic human rights will not be tolerated. However, such formal declarations of high principle and good intent are often largely symbolic and have acted as a smokescreen to hide the fact that anti-racist measures, invariably weakly enforced, have gone hand in hand with anti-immigrant acts that have undermined ethnic minorities and reinforced highly negative stereotypes. This has been shown most clearly in the debates on asylum seekers and refugees. Official rhetoric constantly presents immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers as illegal, bogus, and potentially criminal. The attempt to construct a fortress Europe, a powerfully policed border around the EU, has been reinforced by an official discourse that presents an image of European civilization besieged by a terrifying and monstrous third world. Across Europe, the right-wing populist press has whipped up a moral panic about bogus refugees that has reproduced all the worst stereotypes of anti-black racism. All right. Nelson Moreno says, what the hell? Why did I invite these jokes? I'm just saying, man. I want some lampas. I want some lapas. Next time, I need some lapas. I'm coming to Portugal again. I'm going to smack that booty up. And at the end, I want to walk out to the living room with only that towel around me, dripping in sweat. I want to sit at that kitchen table and eat some lapas. I need some lapas there, man. Next time, I need some preto, some lapas, some cataplana de marisco. I need all of that next time I come to Portugal to spank that booty up. Clapping it all over Porto. Clapping it to Porto, all the way to Lisbon. Then we go to Lagos. We're clapping it. It gets crazy in this house. All right. So, continuing here. Official rhetoric constantly presents immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers as illegal, bogus, and potentially criminal. The attempt to construct a fortress Europe, a powerfully policed border around the EU, has been reinforced by an official discourse that presents an image of European civilization besieged by a terrifying and monstrous third world. Across Europe, the right-wing populist press has whipped up a moral panic about bogus refugees that has reproduced all the worst stereotyping of anti-black racism. Typical of the constant barrage of anti-refugee articles was a 1998 article in The Sun by the columnist Littlejohn. He described a scene at Heathrow Airport in which the gravy train, now arriving at Terminal 1, was carrying bogus asylum seekers who were made most welcome and invited to form a queue at the nearest DSS office and apply for political asylum. Staff are ready and willing to pander to your every need. Terrorists, rapists, and muggers are especially welcome. The British taxpayer will be delighted to pick up the bill. The daily circulation of The Sun at 3.5 million copies is greater than that of all the quality press combined. The Daily Telegraph, Financial Times, The Guardian, Independent, and The Times. Both the Conservative and Labour leadership during the later part of 1999 and early 2000, far from seeking to criticize or dampen such inflammatory press campaigns, sought to outvie each other in how tough and repressive they could be in relation to asylum seekers. The Home Secretary Jack Straw brought in a new Immigration and Asylum Act 1999, the main function of which was to deter further immigration by making conditions so harsh and unpleasant for asylum seekers that none would seek to reach British shores. Deterrence included income support set at 70% of the minimum, the opening of detention centers, the use of food vouchers, and forced dispersal. In spite of increasingly draconian measures, the Shadow Home Secretary and Widecombe accused the government of phenomenal complacency in creating a situation where Britain is now a soft touch. All right. Nelson Moreno says, Simon, you crashing my mom, but I'm your real daddy. You know I'm just joking with you, Nelson Moreno. You big daddy. You the biggest of big daddies. You the biggest big daddy that ever walked. Shout out Nelson Moreno. He a true OG, and he's a true big daddy. He's a true big daddy. Call him Big Daddy. Nelson, Big Daddy Moreno. Shout it out. All right, continuing here. In April, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or UNHCR, accused both Labor and Conservatives of breaking an all-party commitment not to stir up prejudice, and similar complaints were made by the Liberal Democrats and the Commission for Racial Equality that the race card was being played leading into the May local elections. The black trade union leader Bill Morris accused ministers of creating a climate of fear through their inflammatory language. The tabloids responded with a classic new racism line. Criticism of William Hague's manifesto promised to tackle bogus refugees was an exercise in moral McCarthyism, orchestrated by the race relations industry, or the Daily Telegraph, or the Daily Mail, a kind of liberal fascism that stifles any debates. On April 18th, Hague opened up the stakes by revealing Tory plans for the incarceration of all asylum seekers in some 20 new secure detention centers, and stated that he would not be gagged by attitudes of political correctness. The cynical electoral deployment of xenophobia was made clear by a spokesman in the Tory central office. What can the Labour government do? They can't go to the right of us on asylum, but they can't stay left either. Finally, a further UN report of August 2000, which monitored British government policy on tackling racism, condemned the contradiction between progress in some fields of race relations and the failure to respond to a vicious anti-asylum seeker press campaign, as well as the introduction of dispersal policies that led to their social exclusion. As Ann Owers noted, the UN committee were right to conclude that racism is indivisible. There cannot be a trade-off between fair treatment of minority groups already here and those that newly arrive. All right. The contradictions at the heart of the Labour government's self-declared dedication into anti-racism and to uphold the principles of justice and equality was brought home by the widespread debate in February 2000 on the impact of the MacPherson report 1 year on. The official inquiry into the 1993 murder of Stephen Lawrence was supported by the Home Office and resulted in a major realignment of official thinking that racism was largely a matter of individual prejudice to an acceptance of the need to tackle institutional racism, especially within the police. While Jack Straw, in a progress report, claimed that half of MacPherson's recommendations had been implemented by February 2000, this provided an exaggerated sense of progress. The number of ethnic minority officers had actually fallen in 9 of the 43 forces, while a third had failed to hire a single extra black or Asian officer. The overall picture was described by one leading QC as a grim one, littered with broken promises, inaction, and reticence. Most crucial of all, it was at this very time that government, conservative, and media attacks on bogus asylum seekers generated a climate of racial prejudice and xenophobic intolerance that entirely undermined the impact of the MacPherson report and led to a dramatic increase in racial violence. In the 12 months to April 2000, the number of race hate crimes in London doubled to reach a total of 23,346 offenses, a pattern that was repeated across Britain. The alarming rise in attacks, many of which achieved unprecedented levels of brutality, burning to death with petrol, the beating to death of a father before his 14-year-old daughter, was fueled by the rhetoric of politicians on asylum seekers and by harsh government policies. Although the analysis here has been made mainly in relation to the British situation, an identical development could be found in most European states. In Greece, for example, police sweeps against illegal immigrants and the tabling of a harsh new immigration bill led to an anxiety among civil rights groups that racism was being used as a key issue in the run-up to the parliamentary elections of April 9th, 2000. Leading politicians were accused of deploying a language that was close to that of Le Pen and Georges Haider. The drive by EU member states to impose sanctions on Austria because the entry of Haider's Freedom Party into a government coalition was riddled with contradictions. Many of the governments that engaged in this ethical policy had themselves a long track record of making anti-refugee statements that were similar to those of the Freedom Party. Secondly, moves to contain Haider could be interpreted as a strategy by traditional ruling parties to block the advance of a national-populist current, which was regarded as a threat to their own electoral position. In general, it can be argued that European governments, through the overt or tacit support of racial rhetoric, the introduction of even more restrictive and oppressive legislation and policing measures, and through their failure to combat institutional racism, have played a greater part in the reproduction of racism and discriminatory practices in Europe than have the violent and overtly racist political movements of the extreme right. That sums it up right there. That sums it up right there. That sums it up all right there. Am I right? So, yeah. To what extent was the shift towards a new racism in the later quarter of the 20th century elaborated in terms of the traditional modalities of anti-black and anti-Semitic racism that have been our main points of reference? Firstly, with the generalization of immigration controls across Western Europe after '73, the term immigrant began to take on a highly negative connotation so that it became synonymous with non-European. Speeches by Le Pen, Chirac, or Giscard d'Estaing referencing to the immigrants were universally understood to signify Arabs, all those who originated from North Africa. Within the EU in general, the term immigrant or refugee began to refer, in the public imagination, to an increasingly diverse range of stereotyped aliens, a diversity that reflected the complexity of global migrant flows into Europe, of Turks, Somalis, Kurds, Roma, and Sinti of the Balkans, Pakistani and Bangladeshi Muslims, Maghrebians, Afghans, Sri Lankans, and so on. The term black in the sense of African or Afro-Caribbean did not readily catch this diversity, whereas the term immigrant or refugee could, while still carrying almost identical negative meanings. The other as racially inferior, criminal, lazy, and parasitical, dirty, and diseased. In particular, the 1980s and 90s saw the revival of two ancient forms of racism that this study has had to neglect, of intolerance towards gypsies, of Muslims. Islamophobia, rooted in the age-old stereotypes of Orientalism, assumed a particular force as European society took fright at the perception of an external fundamentalist threat from Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi to bin Laden, or of an internal Muslim danger to European culture and identity, symbolized by mosque construction, veiled women, and Muslim schools. While the diversity of stereotypical racisms thus widened in EU states at the turn of the century, the ascent of the new right was also marked by the unexpected revival of anti-Semitism. Before examining this in the conclusion, we take a look at how a similar phenomenon accompanied the rise of the extreme right and virulent forms of xenophobic nationalism in post-communist Central and Eastern Europe. Very interesting stuff here. I love this book, even though I didn't like parts of this chapter where basically it gets into electoral politics, right? Like, you know, like when it gets into like elections and percentages and who won what and who led who, you start to lose me there, right? But I understand that it's important to thread that needle and lay down those details. Nelson Moreno says, they can't handle these Indians, man. I mean, true. I mean, the reason why, you know, they hate the gypsies or Romanis in Europe is because they were the original, you know, dark-skinned black people that moved here the first time. You know what I'm saying? When I think about the Jews, it gives me hope as a black person. When I think about the Romanis, it makes me despair as a black person. Because for centuries, before the creation of the transatlantic slave trade, before race was even a concept, before white supremacy as we know it existed, white folks were terrorizing the Romanis, the Gypsies, whatever you want to call them, and the Jews. Now, the Jews came out on the other side of the white terrorism that they lived under for centuries, generally okay, though it is really, you know, sketchy right now. But when I think about the Romanis, boy, it's bad. Boy, it's bad. It's really, really bad. All right, continuing here. This will be, I think, the last section we're going to read. I think this is just a few pages, yeah. So we only have about 3. No, we got, we got like, all right, we're going till 2:15, just for letting anybody know. Nope, not 2:15. Is this, where is this? Oh, this is the conclusion. All right, so yeah, basically, I think we only have a few pages left. This is the conclusion section. I'm just checking for anybody that wants to know. All right. Yeah, the conclusion, Black and Jew. All right, that's on. Yeah, so basically we only have like 3 pages left. 3 or 4 pages. Yeah. All right, so last section. Any comments, any questions, anything you want to say, put it in the comments and we'll holler at you. Anyway, let's go here. Racism in post-communist Eastern Europe. Within the USSR and the communist bloc states that fell within its sphere of influence, the predominant form of racism after 1945 was anti-Semitic. As had been noted, this partly reflects the relative absence of a maritime colonial tradition and of a significant black presence. Conversely, Eastern Europe, especially Poland, the Ukraine, and Russia, had until 1939 contained the historic and demographic core of world Judaism, as well as a tradition of anti-Semitism that was profoundly rooted in popular culture. After the Great Patriotic War in 1941 and 45, Soviet ideology still officially upheld the principles of international socialism and denied that any Jewish problem existed, since they had been, it was claimed, a total and successful assimilation. In reality, Jews continued to be persecuted under Stalin. As the Soviet Union turned against Israel after 1948, a wave of traditional anti-Semitic persecution took place under the disguise of anti-Zionism. Purges and show trials swept through the Soviet satellite regimes in 1949 and 53, leading to the execution of Slansky, a Jew and general secretary of the Czechoslovakian Communist Party, along with 10 other conspirators in December 1952. Purges also occurred in Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Russia, where a paranoid Stalin, following on a so-called Jewish doctor's plot to murder senior officials, laid plans for the removal of the entire Jewish population to Siberia. Czech Jews, falsely accused of spying on behalf of Israeli and Western intelligence agencies and the capitalist enemy, were attacked in a thinly disguised traditional anti-Semitism that saw the Jews as the eternal enemy within and the agents of a conspiracy to achieve global domination. I'm glad he's doing this because, even though I'm a communist, Marxist, socialist, whatever you want to label me as, or whatever I define as, because the weather defines it. I do think we should be critical of the Soviet Union. And also, I do think we have to be honest about who Stalin was. You know what I'm saying? Stalin did some good things. We're not going to hate on Stalin. You know what I mean? If we're going to hate on Stalin, then we have to throw all the U.S. presidents in the trash, right? Because the same people that tell us they hate Stalin, worship George Washington, that slave-owning son of a bitch. So, there's some good things Stalin did. There's some good things the Soviet Union did, but there's also a lot of negatives that came along with the Soviet Union. And their anti-Semitism, at least under Stalin, needs to be examined, right? So, let's continue here. As the Slovak Pravda claimed during the Slansky trial, it is in the service of the class enemy that the Zionists have wormed their way into the communist parties in order to disrupt and undermine them from within. Certain members of our party, too, have come under the influence of Zionism. They have succumbed to the ideology of cosmopolitanism. In Poland, the liberation of the concentration camps, far from leading to the end of genocide, was soon followed by the Kielce pogrom of 46, and by mid-1947, the murder of some 1,500 Jews. In 1945, there were still 200,000 Jews in Poland. But as a result of persecution and traditional anti-Semitism, also sustained throughout the communist era by the Catholic Church, a mass exodus had almost entirely obliterated the Jewish community by the late 1970s and reduced numbers to a mere 6,000. The accelerating collapse of the old Soviet Empire in the last decade of the 20th century produced conditions that favored the rise of virulent forms of nationalism and populist anti-Semitism. The official but disguised anti-Semitism of the communist parties in Eastern Europe had, in a rather contradictory way, ensured that it remained controlled by government. The single-party state did not provide a political space for opposition movements to make significant use of the issue. However, the extension of glasnost from 1986 onwards, the collapse of the USSR, in December 1991, and the first free elections in Poland in the same year, opened the way to the proliferation of new political parties, many of which cultivated a dangerous form of national populism that appealed, at a time of considerable turmoil and economic dislocation, to an inexperienced electorate. Polish parties like the National Front Fatherland Party, National Democracy, and the National Democratic Front sought potent symbols of national strength in the pre-communist interwar leadership of Roman Dmowski and Marshal Pilsudski, the first epitomizing anti-Semitic nationalism, the second, the strong authoritarian leader. The inevitable turmoil that accompanied the chaotic transition to a free market and to parliamentary democracy provided an opportunity for populist anti-Semites to attack the Jews as the source of economic disorder, cultural and ideological disarray, and the cosmopolitan force behind foreign capitalism, consumerism, moral decay, and the destruction of Polish identity. The fascist Polish Nationalist Union, under its leader Boleslaw Tchaikovsky, now saw the hated years of communist rule as the work of Jewish agents and recruited among unemployed and alienated skinhead youths who began to attack Jewish targets, as well as African students, gypsies, and Romanian asylum seekers. However, by the late 1990s, the relatively successful economic transition in Poland and the stabilization of the political system was a cause of growing optimism, and opinion polls showed an underlying decline in anti-Semitism. In 1975, some 41% of Poles had a negative view of Jews. By 1990, this had declined to 20%. Curiously enough, by 1991, hostility was much higher towards Gypsies, Arabs, and blacks than towards Jews in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, suggesting a shift in these modernizing countries towards the pattern of prejudice to be found in Western Europe. The situation in Russia was, however, much more unstable and potentially dangerous, as the Federation was threatened with total collapse in 91 and 93. In 92, the shock therapy of privatization and deregulation was accompanied by massive economic dislocation, growing unemployment, inflation of over 1,000%, and a fall in production of 20%. 73% of the population was living in acute distress. Such a crisis, accompanied by the humiliating disintegration of the Soviet Union, the withdrawal of troops to Russia, the growth of inter-ethnic conflict and violent crime, political instability, and the loss of the ideological framework supplied by Marxism and communism, even if it had been contested, provided ideal conditions for the proliferation of extreme nationalist movements. Pomiat, led by Dmitry Vasilev, sought to reassert a sense of national pride by idealizing a great pre-communist Russia that had been destroyed by the global conspiracy of the Jews, an evil cosmopolitan force that operated both through capitalism, symbolized by the detested United States, as well as through the imposition of the alien ideology of Marxism. An early 1986 appeal of Pomiat claimed global imperialism, nurtured by Zionism, and its mercenary Masonic lackeys, is trying to drag the world into the spiral of a new planet-wide catastrophe. The murky and paranoid anti-Semitism of the Black Hundreds and the protocols of the Elders of Zion resurfaced with a vengeance in the presidential elections of December 1993. The virulent anti-Semite and clown Zhirinovsky, who promised a heady populist mix of great Russian expansion, strongman dictatorship, and cheap vodka, gained an astonishing 6 million votes. In 1999, bombs were planted in 3 out of the 5 synagogues in Moscow, while the Jewish leader Leopold Kamenovsky was stabbed by a neo-Nazi youth. Political commentators claim that the openly fascist antics of the Führer, Alexander Barkashov, and his Russian national unity movement posed no serious threat. For far more worrying was the spread of anti-Semitism into the mainstream political parties. The Communist Party leader Gennady Zyuganov claimed that there was a Zionist conspiracy to wreck the economy. Our people cannot fail to see that the spread of Zionism in the government is one of the reasons for the current catastrophic conditions of the country, the mass impoverishment, and the process of extinction of its people. Zyuganov refused in the Duma to censor the communist leader and populist demagogue, General Albert Makashov, who threatened to kill the Yids. As Russia moved into the 21st century, it appeared destined to be racked by a profound and dangerous political, economic, and social crisis, and by a potential for the growth of virulent anti-Semitism and/or by the authoritarian forms of nationalism represented by the new President Vladimir Putin. In many ways, the crude and open anti-Semitism of Eastern Europe appears readily explicable in that its roots lie in conditions of economic and political dislocation that were not dissimilar to those of interwar Europe. However, the revival of anti-Semitism within the ambit of the new right in Western Europe, an extreme right that was seeking legitimacy within parliamentary democracy, seems at first to be far more puzzling. The following conclusion goes on to examine the continuing roots of anti-Semitism of the two key modalities of racism, anti-Black and anti-Semitic prejudice, which have been a major concern of this study. Very fascinating stuff. So tomorrow we will be finishing this book. Conclusion. It's been a very wild ride, very interesting ride. This has been not the longest book we've read, but it's been the one with the longest series because, we've been chopping this up slowly, bit by bit. We're going to be wrapping it up with episode 16. So I hope you enjoy it. Hope you come in. Hope you tune in. And let me know what you think we should do next on this channel. And shout out to my guys who hopped into the live stream chat. And shout out to everybody who watched. Shout out Nelson Moreno. Shout out Door of L. Shout out everybody who shows love to me on these streams. Y'all be easy out there. Catch you tomorrow. Peace.